Well, good evening. We're going to be continuing our study of the person of Jesus as he is depicted for us in the Gospel of Mark. You have a handout. Tonight we're going to be talking about Jesus and desperation. We're in the 5th chapter, but in the 4th chapter, just to recap something that we talked about not too long ago about Jesus and nature, you remember that Jesus got in a boat with the disciples, said that they were going to go across to the other side, and then he found him a comfortable place and a pillow and took a nap at the bow of the ship while they started off across the Sea of Galilee. Well, experienced fishermen don't scare easily, but evidently this storm was severe enough that it caused some of them to really be concerned. And I'm not sure, I think it might have been Peter or whoever it was that came in to wake up Jesus, who Mark 4:38 says he was in the stern. I said the bow. He was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And I took that particular line in consideration for tonight, because I think sometimes when we find ourselves in these extreme trials or these extreme experiences where we find ourselves actually feeling desperate, sometimes our cry to God is, "God, where are you? And do you even care that I'm going through this right now?" And so this is what we're going to look at tonight in the 5th chapter. In the 5th chapter, there's actually two stories of two very desperate people who come before Jesus. They both have medical issues, and we just had a list of concerns and needs that we began to share and to pray about, and to know that Jesus is concerned about these matters in our life. But it's ongoing and surprising to me, probably to you too, that the things that panic me don't panic God. And the times when I am overly concerned and say, do you not care what's going on right now? That obviously he not only cares, he has it in his hands, he's got it under control, and I'm the one that's going to have to learn to relax a little bit. We can come to him in our most desperate moments. Psalm 42 says, "Deep calls unto deep at the noise of your waterfalls, and all your waves and billows have gone over me." When it is overwhelming, and you may be going through something in your life right now, it may feel overwhelming. I know we have all experienced times when we weren't sure where we would turn to, that it was going to be, it was that difficult, that hard. And those are desperate times. Well, he finishes that psalm, verse 11, by saying, "Why are you cast down, O my soul? Why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, and the help of my countenance and my God." You have your Bibles, be opening up to the 5th chapter of Mark. We're going to be starting at verse 21, where he departed, began to proclaim in Decapolis and all that Jesus had done for him and all that he marveled. This is when he left the demoniac there in the Gadarenes, and he's come now over to Decapolis. Verse 21 says, "Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him." He was by the sea. Get the picture. He comes across, he disembarks. The crowds are waiting for him. The crowds are ready to mob him, as it were. And verse 22, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet. And you may recall it not because of the Bible story, but because I also shared a personal story of my daughter. How we had come back from overseas. It had been a real ordeal for her. I made the comment that there's 5 in our family. 5 of us came back across from Central America, but only 4 of us came home. Christina was 4 years old when we left. She was 16 when we came back, and she was lost. And she experienced what some missionaries' kids have experienced called reverse culture shock. She came to a country that wasn't hers, and it affected her in tremendous ways. It affected her emotionally, it affected her physically, it affected her spiritually. And I remember the conflicts that we would have and the struggles that we had. And I shared a picture of her with you. I'm not going to pull all of that up again tonight, but just to tell you that after about a year of being here, or a little bit longer, she was 17 years old and was 87 pounds. And her doctor particularly, was concerned for her health, her well-being. And I had my talks with her. We had tried all the things that we had been told to do, and the bottom line was nothing was working. And so like Jairus, I found myself falling at the feet of Jesus and saying, my daughter's dying and there's nothing I can do about it. I can't fix this. And as such, I know what the desperation in his heart was when he came and fell before Jesus. I know that Jairus prayer. And he falls at Jesus' feet. He begs him, verse 23, earnestly saying, my little daughter, not just my daughter, my little daughter lies at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her that she may be healed, and she will live. And from these words, we can find out, and we can figure out some things about Jairus, and I put them down as little bullet points in your notes, that Jairus was a desperate man, but he was also a man of humility. He had come to the place of realizing he couldn't fix this on his own. And so even though he was the ruler of a synagogue, he comes and falls at the feet of Jesus. And that his humility is that which enabled him to be able to start receiving the grace that Jesus was so prepared to offer at that time. He says, verse 24, so Jesus went with him. Great multitude followed him and thronged him. He was in desperation. He says, my little daughter's dying. I can't help her. But he was also a man of faith. He says, but I know that if you lay your hands on her, she will be healed and she will live. And so he was putting all of his faith and trust in the one who could do something about what he couldn't do anything about. Jesus responds with the compassion. There was times when others came to him and said, the centurion who came and said, my servant is homesick. And Jesus said, well, I'll come go with you. He said, no, you just say the word and he'll be well. You don't even have to come. You can just do it from here. He marveled at this man's faith. He says, I've never seen such faith in all of Israel. But it is Jesus in his compassion that says, I'm coming to your house. That should tell us something. That should tell us that when we come and find ourselves in these desperate times, we humble ourselves before the Lord and we say to him, I've got a problem. I'm desperate. I know I can't fix it. I come to you. And then that humility, he acknowledges and he says, I'm right there for you. Now, this story appears in Luke and Mark, and in both those gospel accounts, if you've ever read it in both of those or in a harmony of the gospels, you'll discover very quickly it's the same story. Then his name is given in each one, but in both stories, the story gets interrupted. And it gets interrupted by somebody else's need. And this is the second desperate person that I would like you to see tonight. And it's the story of the woman with the issue of blood. And it starts at verse 25. Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years, had suffered many things from many physicians. It's interesting, we're reading from Mark. Luke tells this story, but he doesn't use that line. Luke won't tell you that she suffered many things at the hands of many physicians, because he himself is a physician. But they both indicate that she had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. I think it's understanding that people with physical problems that are chronic, and in this story, she's been like this for 12 years. For 12 years she's been going through this. And it's been a chronic issue. And it isn't just a health issue. This was an illness that, according to the law, was an illness that made her unclean all the time. For 12 years, according to the law, she was deemed unclean by those around her. Which makes it not just a medical issue, it makes it a social issue, a relationship issue. She couldn't be with other people the way that I'm sure she would have liked to have been. She couldn't be as social as most because of her chronic condition. And so she too is in a desperate situation. And again, if you have ever had to endure chronic pain, there's a point where you sometimes think you're going to get used to it, but then you realize you never really do. But when it's so intense that you can't just live with it, it moves you to a point of saying something's going to have to change. So the story of this woman tells us about her condition. No matter what she tried to do, she found herself getting in a worse condition. Mark states she suffered many things. Like Jairus, desperation can drive us to Jesus or to ruin. If your desperation doesn't drive you to Jesus, it can be sickness, it can be a situation in which no one can seem to help. When you've spent all your energy and all your resources to make things right to no avail, then you generally have two paths that people tend to take. They either continue to seek remedy or just relief. And those who seek relief may find themselves on the wrong path, because if all they're trying to do is relieve the pain of what they're going through, they can turn to all kinds of things. There are people who just, get absorbed in outside activities. I put down here, again, 3 bullet points. Ways that people try to deal with their pain and their desperation. When they're not seeking remedy from God, they'll just seek relief for themselves. And that relief can take the form of diversion. They just absorb themselves in their hobbies or try to stay entertained on some level, activities, whatever. It might be substance. I listed down here alcohol, drugs, but then I put food, and I was trying to avoid putting chocolate specifically. But sometimes we just try to say, well, I'm going to make myself feel better. And what may start out with pain medication or pain management gets out of hand. What happens with trying to ease a night's sleep with a little bit of wine or alcohol or something to help you sleep gets out of hand. And before you realize it, the ways to relief become more of a downfall. You'll notice when I put relationships, sometimes people want to get absorbed in their friends or their family, but then I put lovers, because they're just looking for comfort. That's what relief is. It's comfort from the pain. And so your desperation may drive you to Jesus, or it may drive you to something of just relief. And if it drives you to just relief, you'll never experience the remedy. Because remedy comes from facing the issue, not covering it. Remedy comes from seeking the Lord, not other things or people. Remedy comes from following His direction. I think I put on your sheet, did I put Proverbs 3, 5 through 8? Okay. This is in fact, Cindy just asked me about this verse the other day. Here's where it is, honey. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him. He shall direct your paths. But then I looked and saw the next two verses, and the next two verses were amazing to me. When we begin to seek God and His remedy, when we begin to seek to ask the Lord to be involved in what's going on in our life, when we don't lean on our own understanding, when we don't try to just seek relief, but we acknowledge Him in all that we're doing, He will direct our paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, depart from evil. And look at verse 8. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. That's the promise. You know, if we are seeking the Lord for remedy, His Word says, trust Him with all your heart. Don't try to figure out for yourself. In other words, like I was with Christina, I couldn't figure out what to do with her. I'd come to, as I loved what this one English woman said, I'd come to the end of my tether. And I didn't know what to do next. I turned to Jesus. And He not only fixed the situation, He made a beautiful daughter. And those of you who've met her know what God can do in the life of someone who begins to turn everything over to Him. Desperation calls for a faith in something, or I guess better to say someone, greater than yourself. You don't have the answers. So you turn to the one who does. If you could handle it, you wouldn't be desperate. Did you ever notice that? Desperation comes when you realize, I can't handle this. I can't fix this. Verse 27 goes on with the story. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind Him in the crowd, touched His garment. Now, it doesn't use the terminology here, but can you see by her actions her own humility? That she doesn't come up and just start getting in His face and demanding He do something about her situation. She lets her faith guide her into the humility of just thinking within herself, if I can just touch touch His clothes, I have the faith I will be made whole. Verse 29. So she did. And immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. Jesus, immediately knowing in Himself that power had gone out of Him, turned around to the crowd and asked a very interesting question. I've mentioned this before when we talked about the omniscience of Jesus, that He doesn't know everything that the Father knows. He actually asked the question, who touched my clothes? And His disciples said, you've got to be kidding. I mean, look around you. We are being pushed in by the crowd, and you want to know who touched your clothes? He looked around to see her who had done this thing, but the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came, and now she does what Jairus did. She fell down before Him, told Him the whole truth. He said, daughter, your faith has made you whole, has made you well. Go in peace, be healed of your affliction. There's much that can be brought out about this story about faith and that part involved with how we respond to God. And I hope that you already see it. But I want to get back to Jairus. Did you know we've just left him over on the sidelines? The story starts with him, and then all of a sudden it's interrupted by this other desperate person. And we have her story, which is a tremendous testimony. But I've often asked myself the question, where was Jairus all this time? How many of us would have looked at what Jesus was doing with this woman, especially with the crowd around, and Jesus says, I'll come go home with you, and then He stops to deal with somebody else? How many of us would be tempted to just say, well, I guess that wasn't important enough for him? I think I'll just make my way on home. I think I'll just let let what's going to happen happen. But that's not what he's doing. One of the things that I think, and Cindy asked an interesting question today. She says, this is a lot like our nation in its desperation. What should we as Christians be doing? And Jairus is a good example. We can't get ahead of God. We wait patiently for Him to act. And Jairus, hey, he could have easily have felt offended, slighted, thought, well, he doesn't care enough to continue going with, he's going to get distracted by everybody who's in this crowd. He could have easily have slipped out and said, I wasn't worth the trip. But he doesn't. Because he knows where his faith has to be. He knows from the very get-go, the only one who can do something about his little daughter. Desperation is first focused on the problem. That's what Jairus was focused on. He was focused on the problem of his dying daughter. But when a solution presents itself, as Jesus did when he got out of that boat and came to his side of the city, when the solution presents itself and he knows that the only answer is Jesus, he says, I'm waiting for that. Because Jesus is worth waiting for. Jesus is going to be my answer, and if I have to stand here all day, I'll stand here all day and I'll wait for Jesus. Let him deal with those who he feels he needs to deal with, but I'm not going anywhere. When a solution presents itself, it becomes focused, the person becomes focused on the solution, will not be deterred by interruptions. I told you both gospel accounts present this woman, and she's an interruption to the story, but Jairus doesn't let her become an interruption. He stays steadfast and waits on the Lord. Verse 35. Unfortunately, while he was waiting, the situation went from bad to worse. While he was still speaking, talking about Jesus, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house who said, your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Let me tell you something else I've learned about desperation. Other people don't feel your desperation. They just see the situation. And because they don't feel your desperation, they don't feel your faith. And because they don't feel your faith, they don't know why you are doing what you're doing, is waiting for a man to come who has obviously stopped to help somebody else. And they try to tell him, don't bother him anymore. Just come on home. Don't spend your last hours, don't spend her last hours here. Go home. Be with her. Spend her last hours with her. And then God steps in, steps up, shows out. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken. You see, those kind of words, they discourage us. Those kind of words pull us from our faith. When Jesus heard those words, he turned to him and just undergirded his faith. He says to the ruler of the synagogue, don't be afraid, just believe. You've been steadfast. Don't stop now. And then he, Jesus, permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw, New King James says, a tumult of those who wept and wailed loudly. The Don Francisco song called them paid mourners. And their job was to come to a house where someone had died and just weep and wail and make a big scene. And we know that they're not sincere because as soon as Jesus gives them good news that the girl is not dead, she's just asleep, they start making fun of Jesus. It's again, when God begins to work, those who lack faith will challenge those efforts. They'll challenge you. And they may think they're well-meaning, they may think they're helping, but in reality, they become an obstacle to the outcome. You don't let others deter your faith. Once your faith is set in what you believe God's going to do next, you don't let others talk you out of it. So Jesus kind of put them in their place. He said to them, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child's not dead, but sleeping." They ridiculed him. And when he had put them all outside. This is kind of reminiscent, well, not reminiscent because it's actually before the event, but this is kind of similar to what we'll see him do in the temple with the money changers. He will throw out the unbelieving. When God begins to work, those who lack faith challenge the efforts, but God can overcome them. They only tend to see what is in front of them and not the whole picture with God's involvement. If you take God out of the equation, well then yeah, the little girl's dead, but God isn't to be taken out of the equation. He took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. He took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kumi, which is translated, and I mentioned to you before, Mark translates Aramaic expressions for his Roman readers, which translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Well, I don't have to tell you what happened next. Immediately the girl arose and walked. She was about 12 years of age. Still a little girl. Every father knows that. She may be 12, she may be 16, she may be 17. She's still your little girl when your heart is broken by what she's going through. She was 12 years old, and they were overcome with great amazement. The last verse, verse 43, tells us something very interesting. Do you know that when God steps in, steps up, and shows out in dealing with your issue of desperation, He then involves you? We're not spectators who just stand back in wonderment. We are involved. He turned to that father and that mother and he says, I want you to make sure she gets something to eat. You take care of her. Feed her. Give her something to eat. Don't ever take the mighty works of God for granted. Realize that He is working with you, not just doing things to you or throwing things at you. God provides the remedy. Others would have looked for relief, but God brought the remedy and then included them in the process. He raised the little girl, but her parents needed to give her something to eat. We're not just spectators and bystanders in the overall work of God. We are co-laborers. And then one of the things that I put in there, I think is this on your sheet? Desperation is removed when we place ourselves in the hands of Jesus. Is that the last thing on your sheet? You want to write something else? Because I added to my sheet today. Do you remember how I started with something that wasn't on your sheet from chapter 4 about the disciples coming to Jesus while they were in the boat and they were in the middle of the storm and they asked the question, do you not care that we're perishing, that this is a desperate moment? Do you not care? And when I added that, it occurred to me, yeah, He does care. And how do I know He cares? 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 and 7. Throw it in there at the bottom of your sheet if you want to. Because the other thing I noticed about this verse was it took me right back to Jairus. And the first thing Jairus did when he came to Jesus was to throw himself at Jesus' feet, to humble himself. 1 Peter 5:6 says, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time." But verse 7 says, "Casting all your care upon him." Why? Because he cares for you. If you learn anything about Jesus tonight, know that he cares for you in your most desperate hours. Look for him during those dark nights. Look for him during those times of pain. Cry out to him. In your desperation is where he is most desirous to come and come alongside and to be there for you. And so the stories here of Mark 5, Jesus in desperation, should tell us that Jesus is always there for your times of desperation. He was there that night on the boat, got up from his pillow, stepped outside and said, "Wind, shut up." And the storm ended. Will your storms always end? No, but he will always be there with you in them. And you will always find the comfort that comes from having him with you in the storm. And who knows, he may just bring a remedy so that you don't have to keep looking for relief. Let's pray.